Ren was 8 years old when the war took everything from him. He did not talk about it. There was nothing left to say. The colony ship that carried the last of his people had drifted for 11 days before the Dragon Empire's patrol vessels found it. The ship was half broken, running on almost no power and full of people who had nowhere else to go. The dragons let them board the Ivory Spire. Not out of kindness. Out of policy. The Empire had rules about refugees, and the humans fell under those rules, and so they were allowed to stay. That was all. They were allowed to stay. Nothing more. The adults were given jobs in the lower engine rooms and the waste processing units. The older children were handed cleaning tools and pointed toward the long gray corridors that ran beneath the station's main floors. Nobody explained anything. Nobody asked if they were tired or scared or hungry. A tall dragon with pale green scales simply dropped a mop in front of Ren, pointed left and walked away. Ren picked up the mop and went left. He was small for his age. His hair was brown and badly cut, his boots were too big, and his jacket had a tear along the left shoulder that he had tried to fix with a piece of wire. He did not look like much. That was probably why nobody paid attention to him. On a station full of dragons twice the height of any human adult, one small boy with a mop was simply not worth noticing. Ren did not mind. Being invisible had its uses. He worked quietly every day without complaint. He cleaned the floors of the lower corridors, wiped down the cold metal walls, and emptied the dust filters in the ventilation shafts. The work was not hard. It was just long and lonely. The other human children worked in different sections, and the dragons never spoke to him unless they needed him to move out of the way. He ate his meals alone at the small table in the far corner of the workers' hall and slept on a thin mat in a gray room he shared with 4 other boys who were all too tired to talk by the time night came. He was not unhappy. He was just empty. At night, when the others were asleep, he would sometimes hum quietly to himself. It was an old song. A simple one. His mother used to sing it when he was very small, back when they had a home and a warm kitchen and a window that looked out over the fields. He did not remember all the words anymore. But the tune stayed with him, sitting somewhere deep in his chest where the sadness lived. Humming it did not make the sadness go away. It just made it feel a little less heavy. 3 weeks after arriving on the Ivory Spire, Ren was cleaning a corridor on the upper section of the lower decks. It was a part of the station he had not been to before. The floors here were lighter in color, the walls smoother, and the air smelled faintly of something warm and green, like plants or fresh earth. It was different from the cold metal smell of the lower levels, and Ren slowed down without meaning to, just breathing it in. His cleaning cloth slipped off the edge of his cart. It caught a small current of warm air moving through a vent near the floor and drifted slowly down the hallway ahead of him, turning gently in the air. Ren followed it. It turned a corner, drifted a little further, and slipped under a large door at the end of the passage. Ren stopped in front of the door. It was tall and made of pale stone, with small patterns carved into the edges that he could not read. There was no sign on it that he could understand. There was no guard outside it either, which surprised him. Most important doors on the Ivory Spire had at least 2 guards. This one had none. He pushed it gently with one hand. It opened. The smell hit him first. Warm green, alive. The room beyond was enormous, far bigger than he expected. The ceiling was high and curved, and soft golden light came from long strips embedded in the walls. The floor was covered in thick pale moss that was soft under his boots. There were low stone formations arranged in gentle curves, and between them grew plants he had never seen before, small and glowing faintly at their edges, in colors of blue and silver and soft gold. It was the most beautiful place Ren had ever seen. He stood very still in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. Then he saw them. In the far corner of the room, half hidden behind a curved stone formation, were 2 small dragons. They were unlike any dragon Ren had seen on the station. Every dragon he had encountered so far had been large and dark-scaled, in shades of deep green or gray or brown. These 2 were tiny by dragon standards, barely taller than Ren himself, and their scales were white. Not pale or light-colored. White. Pure and clean as fresh snow, with a faint shimmer to them that caught the golden light and turned it soft. Their eyes were silver, large and round, and at the moment both pairs of those silver eyes were fixed entirely on Ren. Nobody moved. Ren's first thought was that he should leave immediately. This was clearly not a place he was supposed to be. These were clearly not dragons he was supposed to encounter. His cleaning cloth was somewhere on the moss near the door and he should pick it up and go and pretend this had never happened. He did not go. He was not sure why. Maybe it was the way they were looking at him, not with anger or dismissal the way most dragons looked at humans, but with something quieter than that. Something closer to curiosity. Their heads were tilted slightly, both of them at almost the exact same angle, and their small wings were folded tight against their backs the way Ren had noticed young creatures did when they were unsure but not yet afraid. He took one slow step inside and let the door drift mostly closed behind him. The two white dragons did not move. They watched him. Ren walked carefully to the nearest low stone and sat down on it. He set his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, giving them space, the way he used to do with the stray animals back home when he wanted them to come closer without scaring them. The room was very quiet. After a while, without really deciding to, Ren began to hum. It was his mother's song. The same few notes he always came back to when things were too quiet and too heavy. He did not hum loudly. Just softly, under his breath, the melody moving through the warm air of the garden room like something that had always belonged there. He heard a sound. A small scrape of claws on stone. Then another. He kept his eyes low and kept humming. Another scrape. Closer. Then a soft pressure on the moss just to his left. And another just to his right. Ren finished the tune slowly and let the last note fade. Then he looked up. Sol and Pip were sitting right beside him. One on each side, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth coming off their white scales. Their silver eyes were wide and very bright. They were not afraid. They were not angry. They were looking at him with an expression he recognized, even on faces so different from any face he had grown up knowing. They wanted to hear more. Ren looked at them for a moment. Then he started the song again from the beginning. High above the garden room, behind a panel of dark observation glass that looked down over the entire space, a figure stood without moving. Empress Veloris was tall even by dragon standards, her scales a deep and ancient gold, her eyes the color of cold amber. She had been in the middle of reviewing station reports when her head advisor had quietly informed her that the hatchling's garden door had been opened by an unauthorized person. She had come to deal with it herself. But she had not opened the door. She had come to the observation panel instead and looked down, and what she saw had stopped her completely. Her two albino hatchlings, her rarest and most carefully guarded children, were sitting pressed close against a small human boy on a mossy stone. The boy was humming. Sol's eyes were half closed. Pip had leaned her white head just slightly toward the sound. Veloris stood there for a long time. She did not call the guards. She did not open the observation panel. She did not do anything at all. She just watched, one claw resting very lightly against the glass, as the boy's quiet song moved through the warm air of the garden below. The next morning Ren came back. He told himself it was because his cleaning route passed near that corridor anyway. He told himself it was practical. He picked up his cart, took his mop, and walked the long way around the upper-lower deck just as he had the day before. He stopped in front of the pale stone door. He pushed it open. Sol and Pip were already waiting near the entrance. They were sitting upright on the moss, facing the door, their white tails wrapped neatly around their feet. When Ren stepped inside, both of them made a low sound deep in their chests. Not a growl. Something softer than that. Something that reminded Ren of the sound a cat makes when it sees a person it recognizes. He smiled. It was the first real smile he had managed in a long time. He came back the day after that as well. And the day after that. Within a week it had stopped being a decision and simply become part of his day, as natural as eating or sleeping. Finish the lower corridor section, drift toward the pale stone door, push it open, go inside. Sol and Pip were always there. What surprised Ren was how fast they learned. Dragons were supposed to be proud and slow to warm to outsiders. Every human on the station knew that. You kept your head down, you did your work, you did not look the dragons in the eye for too long. That was the unspoken rule. But Sol and Pip had clearly never been told that rule, or if they had they did not care about it, because from the very first day they were curious in the most open and uncomplicated way Ren had ever seen in another creature. They watched everything he did with total attention. On the third day Ren had a small square of paper in his jacket pocket, left over from a note he had been given about his cleaning schedule. He folded it into a boat the way his father had shown him once, a long time ago. Simple folds, nothing complicated, just the basic shape of a little vessel with a pointed front and flat bottom. He set it on the moss. Sol stared at it. He lowered his white head until one silver eye was level with the tiny paper boat and looked at it very carefully from one side and then walked around it slowly and looked at it from the other side. Then he looked up at Ren with an expression that clearly asked what it was supposed to be. Ren picked it up and made a gentle sailing motion with his hand, tilting it side to side the way a boat moves on water. Sol looked at the boat. Then at Ren. Then at the boat again. Then he picked it up very carefully between two of his smallest claws, held it the way Ren had, and tilted it side to side. Pip made a sharp excited sound and pushed her head in close to see. Ren laughed. He could not help it. The sound came out of him before he could think about it, sudden and real, and it bounced off the curved walls of the garden room. Sol and Pip both froze for a half-second, and then Sol did the boat motion again, more enthusiastically this time, and Pip let out that same low warm sound from her chest, and something about the combination of it all made Ren laugh again harder. It was the first time he had laughed since before the war. He spent the rest of that visit teaching them to fold their own boats. Dragon claws were not built for paper folding. The results were crumpled and lopsided and nothing like boats. Sol looked at his finished attempt with deep suspicion, as if the paper had done something personally offensive to him. Pip's version had so many extra folds in it that it looked more like a small crushed rock than a vessel. Ren told them both they had done wonderfully. He was not sure they understood the words yet, but they understood the tone because both of them stood up a little straighter. The drawings came later that same week. Ren had no paper left, but he noticed that the smooth flat sections of stone near the walls collected a fine layer of pale dust each day, the kind that came from the ventilation system. He dragged one finger through it and left a clear dark line. He looked at Sol. Sol looked at the line. Ren drew a circle. Then two pointed ears on top. Then whiskers. Sol leaned in very close. Ren drew four legs and a tail and pointed at the finished cat shape and then made a small meowing sound. Pip made a noise that Ren could only describe as a squeak. She pushed her nose toward the drawing and then looked at Ren and then looked at the drawing again and then very slowly and very deliberately dragged one white claw through the dust beside his drawing. She made a single straight line. Then she looked at Ren as if waiting to be told what it was. Ren nodded seriously. He pointed at her line and said it was excellent. Pip stood up straight exactly the same way Sol had with the paper boat. After that, the dust drawings became a daily activity. Ren drew things and they tried to copy them or add to them. Sol turned out to have something close to an instinct for it. His lines were heavy and a little unsteady, but he paid close attention to shapes, and within a few days his copies of Ren's drawings were recognizable. Pip was less interested in copying and more interested in making her own marks, long looping lines and repeated patterns that meant nothing Ren could identify but that she clearly felt strongly about because she would add to them each day and make small sounds of satisfaction when a new section came out the way she wanted. Ren told them both they were artists. The song took the longest. He had been humming it every visit since the first day. It had become a kind of greeting between them, the way Ren would sit down and start the tune and Sol and Pip would settle close beside him. But one afternoon Sol did something new. He opened his mouth slightly while Ren was humming and let out a very low and very careful sound, trying to match the note. He was not close. Not even slightly. But the effort was so obvious and so serious that Ren kept his face very still to avoid showing his reaction. He hummed the note again gently. Sol tried again. A little closer. Pip tried from the other side, her version coming out higher and stranger than Sol's but with more confidence behind it. They practiced it the way they practiced the drawings. Slowly. A little better each day. Within 2 weeks they had the basic shape of the melody, low and rumbly and nothing like a human voice but recognizable. Unmistakably the same song. Ren sat between them one afternoon listening to them hum it together, their two voices making it into something heavier and older than it had ever sounded when his mother sang it, and he felt something shift quietly in his chest. Not sadness this time. Something else. What Ren did not know was that he was being watched every single day. He had no reason to look up at the high curved wall above the garden's far side. There was nothing there that looked like a window from below, just a smooth dark section between two light panels that he had never paid attention to. But behind that dark section was a long narrow observation corridor, and in that corridor, every day for nearly 3 weeks, Empress Vealoris stood and watched. She came for different reasons each time. The first day she came to make a decision about the boy. She was going to watch for a few minutes and then have him quietly reassigned to a section on the other side of the station. Far enough away that finding the garden again would be impossible. She watched for 2 hours and left without making any decision at all. The second day she told herself she was monitoring the hatchling's behavior for any sign of distress. That was a reasonable thing for an empress to do. She was being responsible. She stayed for 3 hours. After that she stopped making reasons. She simply came. She watched Sol hold a crumpled paper boat like it was something precious. She watched Pip add a new looping line to her dust drawing with an expression of deep concentration. She watched Ren laugh and listened to the sound of it move through the garden room, easy and unguarded, the kind of laugh that could not be performed. She watched her two most sacred children press close against a small human boy every single day without hesitation or uncertainty, as if they had always known him, as if the space beside him was exactly where they were supposed to be. One evening she stayed until the boy had to leave for his dinner hour. Sol and Pip walked with him to the door and stood watching as he disappeared down the corridor. Then they turned back to the garden and Sol picked up the crumpled paper boat from beside his stone and carried it carefully to the warm corner where they slept. He set it down gently before curling up beside his sister. Valorous looked at that small paper boat sitting in the sleeping corner of her most precious children and stood very still for a long time. She was only observing. That was all. She told herself that on the walk back to her throne room. She almost believed it. It started with Sol. One morning Ren pushed open the pale stone door and stepped into the garden, and Sol was not waiting near the entrance the way he always was. Pip was there, sitting alone near the low stone where they usually spent most of their time, but she was not drawing in the dust or making her looping patterns. She was just sitting, her white wings folded tight, her silver eyes watching the far corner of the room. Ren followed her gaze. Sol was lying down behind one of the curved stone formations. His head was resting flat on the moss, his eyes half open, his white scales dull in a way Ren had not seen before. The shimmer that usually caught the golden light and scattered it softly around him was gone. He looked flat, heavy, like something had pressed all the brightness out of him overnight. Ren crossed the room and crouched down beside him. Sol's eyes moved to his face. He made a very small version of the low warm sound he usually made when Ren arrived. But it cost him something to make it. Ren could tell. He reached out slowly and rested the back of his hand against the side of Sol's neck, the way he used to check on the younger children back in the colony when the cold season came. Sol's scales were hot. Not the ordinary warm that Ren had gotten used to feeling when they sat close together. This was a different kind of heat, dry and sharp and wrong. Ren stood up and went straight to find someone. It took him 20 minutes and 3 wrong turns before he found a station worker who understood enough of his words to get a message to the right place. Within the hour the garden room had 3 dragon healers in it, tall and serious with their dark robes and their long instrument cases, moving around Sol with quiet efficiency. They checked his temperature and his scale color and the rhythm of his breathing and spoke to each other in low dragon words that Ren could not follow. Then they built a temporary stone partition in the corner of the garden, a low curved wall that created a small separate space. They moved Sol behind it. They told Pip to stay on the other side. They looked at Ren standing near the door and said nothing to him at all, which he understood meant he should leave. He left. But he came back the next morning. And the morning after that. By the second day Pip had the fever too. The head healer, Aldrich, was a tall dragon with dark gray scales and very steady hands. He had been treating members of the imperial family for 40 years and he moved through the garden room with the calm confidence of someone who had handled worse than this. He ordered the stone recovery chambers prepared, cold smooth spaces built into the lower walls where the temperature was controlled and the light was dim. He ordered complete silence in the surrounding corridors. He ordered the hatchlings kept still and separate, because that was the dragon way of healing. Rest, quiet, isolation. Let the body do its work without distraction. It was the right treatment. Aldrich had used it many times. It worked. Except it was not working. On the 3rd day both Sol and Pip were worse. Their scales had gone from dull to gray at the edges. They were not eating. Sol had stopped making any sounds at all when Ren came to the door, and Pip, who was usually the more active of the two, was lying completely still with her eyes closed. The warmth that Ren had always felt coming off them was gone, replaced by a dry, tight heat that felt nothing like comfort. Aldrich adjusted the treatment. He brought in 2 more healers. He changed the temperature in the recovery chambers and added a mineral compound to their water that he said would help. He was not panicking. He was methodical and careful and completely in control. But the hatchlings kept getting worse. Ren sat outside the garden room on the floor of the corridor for most of the 4th day. He was not supposed to be there. His cleaning shift had ended hours ago and he had no official reason to be in this section of the station. But nobody came to move him and so he stayed, his back against the cold wall, listening to the silence behind the pale stone door. He thought about the last time people he cared about were sick. On the colony before everything ended, there had been a winter illness that moved through the settlement when Ren was 6. His mother had sat up for 3 nights with the younger children in their building, not because she was a healer, she had no special training, but because she believed that sick people should not be alone. She made warm broth from whatever she had. She sang. She told slow, easy stories. She kept the blankets even and the room gently lit and her hand available whenever someone needed to hold something. Most of the children recovered faster than anyone expected. Ren had asked her once why she stayed up all night when she could have just left medicine and let them sleep. She had thought about it for a moment and then said that being sick was frightening, and frightened people healed better when they knew someone was there. He sat in the corridor outside the garden room and thought about that for a long time. Then he went back to his sleeping quarters, waited until the station's night cycle dimmed the corridor lights to their lowest setting, and got up again. He took the 2 thin blankets from his mat. He went to the workers' kitchen, which was empty at that hour, and heated water and added the dried broth powder that the kitchen kept in a large container near the back shelf. He poured it into the largest cup he could find and wrapped it carefully in a cloth to keep it warm. He went back to the upper-lower deck and stood in front of the pale stone door. There was a guard now. One dragon, standing to the left of the door with his arms folded, his dark green scales blending into the corridor shadows. Ren stood there for a moment. Then he simply walked forward, pushed the door open and went inside. The guard said something sharp behind him. Ren kept walking. The guard did not follow. Ren was never entirely sure why. Maybe the guard assumed someone with that much calm confidence had a reason to be there. Maybe he went to find someone more senior to handle it. Either way, the door swung shut behind Ren and he was inside. The garden was different at night. The golden light strips had dimmed to a low blue, and the glowing plants along the walls were brighter in the darkness, their soft silver and gold edges pulsing very gently. The stone recovery chambers were built into the far wall, 2 low curved openings like small caves, one for each hatchling. Ren crossed the room quietly and crouched down between the 2 openings. Sol was inside the left one, curled tight, his breathing shallow and uneven. Pip was in the right one, her eyes closed, her white scales sheened with that dry wrong heat. Neither of them responded when he arrived. That scared him more than anything else had. He unfolded the first blanket and laid it gently over Sol. Sol's scales were designed for far colder temperatures than a thin human blanket could address. Ren knew that, but his mother had always said warmth was as much a feeling as a temperature. He tucked the edge carefully against Sol's side and then did the same for Pip with the second blanket. Then he sat down cross-legged on the moss between them, set the cup of warm broth in his lap and began to talk. He did not talk about anything important. He talked about the paper boats and how Sol's first one had looked more like a crushed hat than a vessel. He talked about Pip's dust drawings and how he thought the long looping ones she made looked like the rivers on the planet maps he had seen in the station's common room. He talked quietly and without stopping, his voice low and steady, filling the small space between the 2 recovery chambers with something alive and warm. After a while he started the song. He hummed it through once, then started it again with the words, the ones he remembered and soft sounds to fill the ones he had forgotten. He kept his voice gentle and even, no urgency in it, just the melody moving through the dim blue air of the room the same way it always did. Somewhere in the second round of the song, Pip's eyes opened. She did not move. She just looked at him with her silver eyes, glassy and tired, but open. Where? Ren kept singing and reached out slowly and rested his hand lightly against the edge of her blanket. She made the smallest possible version of her low warm sound. Ren stayed until morning. He refilled the broth cup twice from the small water station near the garden wall, adding the last of his broth powder each time. He talked and hummed and sat quietly and talked again. Once in the deep middle of the night, Sol shifted, turned slightly toward the sound of Ren's voice, and let out a long slow breath that sounded like something releasing. When the station lights shifted from night blue to morning gold, both hatchlings were breathing evenly. Sol's scales had color again, faint but there, the shimmer beginning to return at the edges. Pip was asleep but her heat had dropped. Ren pressed the back of his hand to her neck the same way he had on the first morning and felt the difference immediately. Cooler. Steadier. Right. He was still sitting there between them, his back against the stone wall, his eyes heavy when the garden room door opened. Aldrich came in first, stopped when he saw Ren and stood very still. Then Empress Vealoris stepped through the door behind him. She looked at her healer. She looked at the 2 hatchlings breathing calmly under their thin human blankets. She looked at the small cup with the dried broth residue at the bottom. She looked at Ren sitting exhausted on the moss floor between her 2 most precious children, his hair pushed sideways from leaning against the wall, his eyes red from a sleepless night. She did not speak. Ren looked up at her and said the only thing he knew to be true. They were scared. They just needed someone to stay. The Empress stood in the doorway of the garden room and said nothing at all for a very long time. The news moved through the ivory spire the way cold air moves through a cracked window. Slowly at first, then everywhere at once. By the morning after Ren's night in the garden room, 3 of the station's senior staff already knew that a human child had been found sleeping on the floor between the Imperial hatchlings. By midday, half the administrative level had heard some version of it. By evening, the story had reached the noble quarters on the upper floors, and by the time the station's night cycle began, The noble Crest had already sent formal messages to 6 members of the High Council requesting an emergency assembly. Crest was not a dragon who raised his voice often. He did not need to. He was old, with deep bronze scales that had gone dark at the edges with age, and he had served on the High Council for longer than most of the station's current residents had been alive. His authority came not from shouting but from stillness, the particular kind of stillness that made everyone in a room aware that he was the most important person in it. When Crest decided something needed to be addressed, it was addressed. And Crest had decided that this needed to be addressed immediately. The court session was called for the following morning. Ren did not know about it until it was already happening. He had spent the previous day in a state of quiet relief, checking on Sol and Pip from the garden doorway, watching their color return and their movement grow steadier, feeling the tight knot in his chest loosen by small degrees. Aldrich had not spoken to him directly but had given him one long unreadable look that Ren had decided to interpret as neutral. The Empress had not returned to the garden. The guard outside the door had been doubled, but neither of them had told Ren to leave, so he stayed close and kept coming back. He was in the middle of his morning cleaning shift when 2 station officials appeared at the end of his corridor. They did not explain anything. They simply told him he was required in the main assembly hall and that he should come now. Their tone was polite in the way that made clear politeness was not actually being offered. Ren set down his mop, wiped his hands on his jacket and followed them. The assembly hall was the largest room Ren had ever been inside. It was built in the high center of the ivory spire, a vast circular space with walls of pale gold stone that rose so far above the floor they disappeared into soft shadow at the top. The floor was smooth and pale, carved with long repeating patterns that Ren could not read. Around the edges of the room, arranged in curved rising rows like the inside of a bowl, sat dragons. Dozens of them. Nobles, council members, senior advisors, all in their formal coverings, all watching the center of the room with the focused attention of people who had come expecting something significant. At the far end of the room, on a raised section of floor framed by 2 tall carved columns, sat Empress Veloris. She was very still. Her amber eyes moved to Ren when he entered but her expression did not change. In the center of the floor, already speaking, stood Crest. His voice was measured and clear, designed to reach every corner of the enormous room without effort. He was not speaking to Ren. He was speaking to the assembly, his head turning slowly as he addressed the full circle of seated dragons. Ren caught enough of the words to understand the general shape of what was being said. His name came up several times. The word human came up more. Then a station official leaned down and translated quietly near Ren's ear. Crest was saying that the situation had gone far enough. He was saying that a human servant child had been given repeated unauthorized access to the most sacred and protected space on the entire station. He was saying that the Imperial Hatchlings, the rarest dragons born in 3 generations, had been allowed to form an inappropriate attachment to a being of no status, no lineage and no place in the Imperial structure. He was saying that this was not a small problem. It was a failure of the station's entire order. He was saying that the boy needed to be removed. Today. Permanently. Assigned to a workstation on the furthest outer ring of the Empire where this kind of confusion could not happen again. Ren stood in the center of that enormous room and kept his face still. He was frightened. He would not have pretended otherwise if anyone had asked. But he had spent the last several weeks on a station where no one paid attention to him, had survived a war that took everything he had sat alone through a long cold night in a dim garden room willing 2 sick dragons to get better through nothing but presents and an old song. He was 8 years old and he had already learned that fear was not the same as helplessness. He stood straight and kept his eyes forward. Crest finished his address and turned to the Empress. It was the moment where she was expected to give the order. That was how it worked. The council presented the situation, the Empress decided, and the matter was closed. Crest had presented the situation very clearly. The decision should have taken about 10 seconds. Veloris did not speak. The silence stretched. A few council members shifted slightly in their seats. Crest waited with his particular patient stillness. The Empress looked at the center of the floor with her amber eyes and said nothing. Then the garden room door opened. Not the main assembly entrance. The side door, the smaller one set into the left wall that connected through a short passage to the Imperial private corridors. It opened with a sound that was soft and ordinary, completely out of place in the heavy silence of the assembly, and through it came Sol and Pip. They should not have been there. They were supposed to be in the garden, still recovering, still resting under Aldrich's careful instructions. They were clearly not fully well yet. Sol's movement was slightly slower than usual and Pip held her left wing at a careful angle, but their eyes were clear and their heads were up, and they walked into that enormous formal room with the particular directness of creatures who knew exactly where they were going. They crossed the pale carved floor without hesitation. They stopped in front of Ren. Then they turned around. They stood side by side facing the assembly, Sol on the left and Pip on the right, their wings opening slowly to their full span, not aggressively, not as a threat, just open and steady and present. Their white scales caught the hall's light and scattered it across the floor in small bright patterns. Their silver eyes moved across the rows of watching dragons without flinching. They did not make a sound. They did not need to. The message was completely clear. The hall was absolutely silent. Crest stared at the two hatchlings. His bronze face showed nothing, but something moved behind his eyes that Ren could not name. He looked at the white dragons standing in front of the small human boy with their wings spread and their feet planted and their expression steady, and he appeared to be experiencing the particular difficulty of a dragon who has prepared thoroughly for a situation that has just become a completely different situation. He turned back to the Empress. Everyone turned back to the Empress. Veloris had not moved. She was still in the same position she had held for the entire session, upright, hands resting on the arms of her seat, amber eyes looking at the center of the room. But something about her stillness had changed. It had shifted from the stillness of waiting into the stillness of someone who has already made up their mind and is simply letting the moment arrive in its own time. Crest spoke carefully. Your Majesty, the hatchlings are young. They do not fully understand the implications of what they are doing. This is precisely why the Council's guidance exists. We are here to protect the Empire's order, including protecting the heirs from attachments that are not appropriate to their station. He paused. The boy should be removed. For their sake as much as anything else. The hall waited. Pip turned her head and looked up at Ren. Just for a moment. Her silver eyes found his face with the same direct, simple attention she gave to everything she decided mattered. Then she turned back to face the assembly. Sol had not moved at all. He stood with the focused stillness of a creature twice his age, his wings steady, his feet on the pale carved floor like he had grown there. Ren looked at the two of them standing in front of him and felt something press hard against the inside of his chest. Not fear this time. Something that felt like being known. He looked up at Empress Veloris on her raised platform at the far end of the room. She was already looking at him. Her amber eyes held his for a long moment and then moved to her children, standing white and steady in the middle of the ancient hall, and something passed across her face that was gone before Ren could fully identify it. But it was there. She rose from her seat. The entire assembly rose with her, automatic, immediate, 3,000 years of court tradition moving everybody in the room to its feet the moment the Empress stood. The sound of it, dozens of dragons rising at once, moved through the hall like a single breath. Veloris stepped down from the raised platform. She walked to the center of the floor and stood before her two hatchlings and the small human boy they had placed themselves in front of, and the hall was so quiet that Ren could hear the soft sound of her footsteps on the stone. She looked at Crest. When she spoke, her voice was low and even and filled every corner of the room without effort. I will address this matter now. The hall was completely still. Every dragon in the assembly had risen when the Empress stood, and now they remained standing, motionless in their curved rows, watching Veloris walk slowly to the center of the pale carved floor. The sound of her footsteps was the only sound in the entire room. Steady. Unhurried. Each step placed with the calm certainty of someone who had walked into difficult rooms for 3,000 years and had never once turned back from any of them. She stopped in front of Sol and Pip. She looked at them for a long moment. Not the evaluating look of an empress examining her heirs. Something quieter than that. She looked at Sol's wings still open and steady despite the fact that he had been sick 4 days ago and was clearly still tired. She looked at Pip's silver eyes, clear and direct, looking back at her without apology. She looked at the two of them standing in front of a small human boy in the middle of the most formal room on the station, in front of the full High Council and every senior noble of the Draconis court, and she saw something in them that she had been watching grow for weeks from behind a dark observation window. She had just never let herself name it until now. She turned to face the assembly. Crest stood at the front of the council row, his bronze face composed, his posture carrying the patient confidence of someone who had made a clear argument and was waiting for the logical conclusion. Around him the other council members were still, their expressions ranging from expectant to carefully neutral. Every eye in the room was on the Empress. Veloris let the silence sit for one more moment. Then she spoke. My heirs stood in this hall today and every member of this council called it weakness. Her voice was calm. Not cold, not angry, just clear, the kind of clarity that comes from complete certainty. I have sat on this throne for longer than most of the families represented in this room have existed. I have watched this empire make decisions based on pride and tradition and the fear of what is different. I have made those decisions myself. I understand why they are made." She paused. "But I have also spent the last several weeks watching my children learn something that this court has never once taught them." Crest opened his mouth slightly. Veloris continued without acknowledging it. "They were taught the history of the empire. They were taught the names of every noble lineage, the terms of every alliance, the correct posture for every formal occasion. They were taught that they are rare and precious and set apart from ordinary things." She looked at Sol and Pip, still standing in the center of the floor. "And then a small human boy sat down on the moss in their garden and taught them how to fold paper and hum a song and laugh." A very quiet sound moved through the assembly. Not agreement. Not objection. Something more uncertain than either. "My heirs did not become less because of that," Veloris said. "They became more. They learned to be curious without being told to. They learned to care for something outside themselves without being ordered to. And when that boy spent a night on the floor between their sick beds keeping them calm with nothing but his voice and his presence, they learned that the most important thing a living creature can do for another is simply to stay." She looked at Crest directly. "You call that weakness? I call it the only lesson worth learning." Crest held her gaze with the steadiness of long practice. His voice was careful and measured when he spoke. "Your Majesty, with great respect, the court's concern is not about lessons. It is about order. The imperial heirs have a position in this empire that requires clear boundaries. If those boundaries are loosened for one exception, the structure that protects them and this throne becomes uncertain. We are not questioning the boy's character. We are protecting the integrity of the imperial line." It was a good argument. Ren could tell that even without fully understanding all the words the translator was murmuring near his ear. It was calm and reasonable, and it had the weight of 3,000 years of tradition behind it, and several of the council members were nodding slightly in the careful way of people who agree but are watching to see which way the room will go before they show it too clearly. Veloris looked at Crest for a long moment. Then she looked past him, past the whole assembly, at nothing in particular, and Ren had the sense that she was looking at something only she could see. Some long internal distance. Some calculation that had nothing to do with the room and everything to do with what she had watched through that dark observation window night after night, alone in the corridor above the garden. She looked back at the room. 3,000 years ago, she said, the first Draconis Empress stood in a hall not entirely unlike this one and made a decision that every advisor she had told her was wrong. She chose to extend the Empire's protection to a species that had nothing to offer in return at the time. No resources, no military strength, no strategic value. Just need. The room was very quiet. Every member of her council objected. They used words like integrity and order and appropriate boundaries. The faintest shift moved across Veloris's expression. That species became our most loyal alliance for 800 years. She turned slightly and looked at Ren. He was standing very still behind Sol and Pip, his worn jacket with the wire-mended shoulder, his two big boots, his brown hair and his tired eyes that had stayed open all night in a dim garden room because he believed that sick creatures should not be alone. He looked back at her without flinching. She had noticed that about him early. He was a child with nothing. No power, no status, no protection on this station, no reason at all to feel secure. And yet he looked at her, the Empress of the Draconis Imperium, with the same direct quiet attention he gave to everything he decided mattered. Not because he was brave in the way that required effort. Because he was simply, completely himself, and himself was not afraid of being seen. She made her decision. She had made it some time ago, she understood now. She had just been waiting for the moment to be right. She drew herself to her full height. By imperial authority, effective from this moment, the human child Ren is hereby named Ward of the Imperial Hatchlings. The silence that followed was so complete that Ren could hear his own heartbeat. This title carries full rights of residence, protection and standing within the imperial household. It is granted in recognition of service to the imperial heirs that no member of this court, with all their lineage and all their training, was able to provide. Crest's composure did not break. But something in it shifted, a very small tightening around his eyes that on a less controlled face would have been open shock. "This title has not been granted to a non-dragon in the history of this empire," he said carefully. "Your Majesty surely understands that the precedent." "I am the precedent," Veloris said simply. The room had no answer for that. She turned to her heirs. Sol and Pip had been standing with their wings open for the entire session. Now, slowly, Sol folded his wings. He turned around. He looked at Ren with his large silver eyes and then he reached out and took Ren's left hand in his smallest claw, carefully, the way he had learned to hold the paper boats, with enough grip to hold and enough gentleness not to crush. Pip turned too. She took his right hand. Ren looked down at his 2 hands held in 2 white dragon claws in the middle of the most important room on the station, in front of the entire High Council of the Draconis Empire, and he felt something happen in his chest that he did not have a word for. It was not happiness exactly, though it was close to happiness. It was something more like the feeling of a door opening into a warm room after a very long time in the cold. He did not fully understand the title the Empress had given him. Ward of the Imperial Hatchlings. He did not know what it meant for the Empire or for the court or for the 3,000 years of tradition that Crest had spoken about. He was 8 years old with a wire-mended jacket and he had arrived on this station with a mop and nothing else. But Sol's claw was warm around his left hand. And Pip's was warm around his right. And the Empress was looking at the 3 of them in the center of that ancient hall with something in her amber eyes that was softer than anything Ren had ever expected to see there. He looked up at her. She looked back at him for a moment and then, very slightly, she inclined her head. It was a small gesture. The kind that could almost be missed. But Ren did not miss it. He held Sol's hand and Pip's hand and stood in the middle of the great hall of the Ivory Spire and understood, without needing any more words, that he was not a refugee on a borrowed station anymore. He was home. 12 years passed the way deep space passes outside a window. Quietly. Steadily. With more distance covered than you realize until you turn around and look back. Ren was no longer a small boy with a wire-mended jacket and 2 big boots. He was 20 years old now, lean and steady, with the kind of quietness about him that came not from having nothing to say but from having learned a long time ago that the right words at the right moment were worth more than many words at the wrong one. He kept his hair short and his posture straight and he had long since learned enough of the dragon language to follow most conversations without a translator, though he still preferred to think in his own tongue first. He had a proper room now. Not a gray sleeping space on a thin mat. A real room in the Imperial household wing, with a window that looked out over the dark between stars. Sol and Pip were not small anymore either. They had grown into the kind of dragons that made younger station residents stop in corridors and stand a little straighter without quite knowing why. Sol was tall and broad across the shoulders, his white scales carrying a deep steady shimmer that had only strengthened with age. He moved with a deliberate calm that his tutors had tried for years to teach him through formal instruction and had ultimately been taught to him instead by a small human boy sitting on moss and folding paper. Pip was slightly leaner than her brother, quicker in her movements, with a quality of attention in her silver eyes that made the people she looked at feel both seen and considered carefully before any judgment was formed. The court had watched them grow with a mixture of pride and something it could not quite categorize. They were not what anyone had expected. They were better. The crisis arrived without much warning the way most real crises do. Not dramatically, not with a single loud moment that everyone could point to later as the beginning. Just a slow accumulation of tension across 3 separate border regions, 3 different species, 3 sets of old grievances that had been sitting unaddressed for long enough to harden into something dangerous. The Keth were a mineral-rich species from the outer belt who believed the Empire had taken trade routes that belonged to them by prior claim. The Solani were a quiet and deeply proud people whose border stations had been overlooked in 3 consecutive Imperial resource distributions, not out of malice but out of the kind of administrative carelessness that felt like malice to the ones on the receiving end. The Vreth were simply afraid. They were smaller than most spacefaring species and they had watched the Draconis Empire grow for a century and they had decided, quietly and without telling anyone directly, that they were probably next. None of these 3 situations required a war. But all 3 were moving toward one. The High Council convened an emergency session. Crest was older now, his bronze scales darker at the edges, but his posture was the same and his voice carried the same measured authority it always had. He laid out the military options with the thoroughness of long practice. Defensive positioning along the Keth border. A show of Imperial fleet strength near the Solani stations. A formal warning delivered to the Vreth leadership. It was logical. It was the kind of response that the Empire had used before and that had produced results before, the particular result of situations going quiet because the other party became afraid to push further. Sol listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. Then he said, "No." The council looked at him. "Not no to addressing it," Sol said. His voice was deep and even, carrying the same quality his mother's did of filling a room without effort. "No to that method. We are not going to solve fear with more fear. We are not going to solve the feeling of being overlooked by making people more afraid of us. That is not a solution. That is a delay." Crest looked at him with the patient expression of someone managing a familiar conversation. Your Imperial Highness, the Empire's strength is its clarity. Other species understand force. They understand position. Negotiation from a place of demonstrated strength is not cruelty, it is communication. It is the only language we have bothered to learn, Sol said. The council was quiet. Pip spoke from beside her brother. The Keth believe we took something from them. We should find out if they are right, and if they are, we should say so directly and correct it. The Solani feel invisible to us. We should make them visible. The Vreth are afraid of us. She paused. We should ask them what specifically they are afraid of and then show them, honestly, whether that fear is accurate. One of the older council members made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one. With respect, Your Highness, that approach assumes the other parties will respond to honesty with honesty. That is an enormous assumption. Pip looked at him with her silver eyes. Most creatures respond to being treated with honesty and care by giving honesty and care in return, she said. It is not a complicated idea. We learned it when we were very young. She did not look at Ren when she said it. She did not need to. Everyone in the room who had been on the Ivory Spire for more than a decade understood the reference completely. The council argued for the rest of the day. The debate was long and detailed and went in circles several times in the way that debates do when the people involved are not actually uncertain about the facts but are uncertain about whether they are allowed to believe what the facts are showing them. In the end, Vealoris made the decision. She approved Sol and Pip's approach. The negotiations took 3 weeks. Sol met with the Keth delegation first. He came without a fleet display and without a formal show of imperial ceremony. He came with the trade route records going back 200 years, and he sat across from the Keth representatives and went through the records with them and found 2 days in that they were correct. The Empire had absorbed a route that the prior mapping had recorded as Keth territory. Not through malice. Through the kind of careless assumption that large empires make when they have been large long enough to stop checking. Sol said so directly. He said the Empire was wrong. He said it clearly and without softening it into something more comfortable. The lead Keth representative was silent for a long moment. Then she said that no Imperial representative had ever said that to them before. Sol said that was also something that needed to change. The Keth agreement was signed 4 days later. Pip handled the Solani and the Vreth simultaneously, moving between the two delegations with the quick focused attention that had always been her particular quality. The Solani needed to be seen, and she saw them, thoroughly and specifically, learning the names of their stations and their leaders and the particular details of what had been missed and why it mattered. The Vreth needed to be heard, and she heard them, sitting with their representatives for an entire afternoon while they described, haltingly at first and then with increasing detail, exactly what they feared about the Empire and why. She did not argue with any of it. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. At the end of the afternoon, the lead Vreth representative asked her why she was listening so carefully. Pip thought about it honestly before answering. Because someone did that for me once, she said. When I was small and sick and frightened. He just sat with me and stayed. And it turned out that was the most important thing anyone could have done. All 3 agreements were signed before the end of the 3rd week. No fleet movements. No formal warnings. No shows of strength. 3 wars that had been building for years simply did not happen. The night the last agreement was confirmed, the Ivory Spire held a formal reception in the Great Assembly Hall. The hall was full and bright and loud with the particular energy of people who had been afraid of something and are now, unexpectedly, not. Sol and Pip stood at the center of it and received the council's acknowledgement with the steady grace of dragons who had known exactly what they were doing and had done it anyway in the face of serious doubt. Ren was not at the center of the room. He was where he had always been most comfortable. To the side. Near the edge. Watching. He was the first human advisor in the inner court of the Draconis Empire, a fact that still occasionally surprised him when he saw it written formally on station documents. He had no title beyond that. He did not need one. His actual function was understood by everyone who mattered, which was that Sol and Pip trusted him completely and the Empress listened when he spoke, and those 2 facts together made him more effective than any formal title could have. He stood near the wide observation window at the side of the hall and looked out at the stars. He heard footsteps behind him. Slow and steady, the particular weight of someone very large moving very deliberately. Vealoris stopped beside him. She was older than she had been when he arrived, though age moved differently in dragons than in humans, and she was still enormously, quietly powerful in the way that deep things are. Her gold scales carried more depth than they had when he first looked up at her from the moss floor of the garden room, her amber eyes the same color they had always been. They stood side by side and looked at the stars together for a long time without speaking. It was comfortable. It had been comfortable for years. Ren had learned that Vealoris was not a dragon who filled silence for the sake of filling it, and he had always been the same, and so they had developed over time the particular ease of two people who can be quiet together without it meaning anything is wrong. Then she spoke. "That first night," she said. "When you went into the garden and sat down and started to hum." She paused. "Were you afraid?" Ren looked at the stars. "Terrified," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "And the night you slipped past the guard with the blankets. When they were sick." "Also terrified." "And the assembly hall." "Standing in the center of my full court while Crest made his argument." Ren smiled slightly at the stars. "Considerably terrified." Vealoris looked out at the dark between stars for a long moment. "You were terrified every time," she said quietly. "And every time you stayed anyway." She turned her head and looked at him with her ancient amber eyes. "That makes you braver than every dragon in my court." Ren looked back at her. The same way he always had from the very first day. Direct and quiet and completely himself. "I learned it from my mother," he said. "She said frightened people heal better when they know someone is there." Vealoris held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked back at the stars and said nothing else. But she stayed where she was, standing beside him at the window, looking out at the same dark and the same light, while behind them the hall rang with the sound of 3 wars that had not happened and 2 white dragons who had grown up knowing how to choose. The stars burned on the way they always had. Patient and very far away and completely indifferent to empires. But the window was warm. And neither of them moved.